First of all, I'm very happy to be here. I'm quite grateful to be able to speak to you all today. I did this research over the course of 2 years during the pandemic, and I really wished that there was some way I could share it. So it's a real blessing to be here and to be able to spread this small bit of knowledge I've uncovered. But first, I would like to make a few disclaimers before I begin. The first disclaimer I have is about information. And so what I'm going to be talking about are a group of mystics from Europe of the 14th century and the books that they left behind. But I don't believe that if you read all of these books, you're necessarily going to become a better mystic, because obviously it must be rooted in your own experience. But I'm presenting these books here as an offering that maybe there might be a particular speaker or a particular mystic whose vision might influence you, and you might want to read their writings. And the second disclaimer is I haven't actually read all of these books. I've read most of them, but there are a few books that I'm recommending that I have not read. I've tried to compile a bibliography that other people could choose from. And the third thing I'd like to say is even if I were an expert in this and I knew a lot about it, this subject is incredibly deep and no one really knows much about it or knows anything for sure, because we're talking about a group of orders which existed outside of the church and who wrote very little. And what they did write down is full of sort of mysterious figures, like the friend of God of the Oberland, who's almost certainly a visionary figure or an angel, but might be a real person. And we're not actually sure. No one really knows. I also don't read German. If anyone does know more about this and in the Q&A would like to correct anything I'm saying, I'd be very excited to hear about this. So what does the 14th century have to do with Rosicrucianism? So when we talk about the beginnings of radical pietism, we usually begin with Jakob Böhme. And one second, I'm just gonna make that smaller so people here can read. We usually begin with Jakob Böhme, the mystic who's sort of loosely connected to the Rosicrucians. But the mystical tradition that Böhme was working in actually begins much earlier. There already was a German Christian mysticism which existed before the Lutheran Reformation, which had its own character in Christendom and even informed the character of the Reformation. And Luther himself was very influenced by this movement. And so there's this sort of enigmatic remark that Antoine Fèvre makes in Theosophy, Imagination, Tradition, where he says that Rosicrucianism began when German mysticism encountered Hermeticism through Paracelsus. And obviously this means that German mysticism had to exist beforehand. And we know that this is the case because Paracelsian alchemy really stresses the importance of the outer light as a form of mystic interpretation. And he includes salt as a principle with sulfur and mercury, which reflects the Holy Trinity. And in the Fama, as I'm sure most of us will know, Paracelsus is mentioned as being the ideal Rosicrucian, although he's not part of the order. And we also know that people like Tobias Hess, who was a Paracelsian, was attacked for being a Galenist. So people who were involved with Rosicrucian at the time were deeply part of this sort of radical Paracelsian movement. And I think that often when studying or practicing Rosicrucianism, it's the Hermetic and alchemical elements which come to the foreground. But in the background, there's this pre-existing German mysticism, which sort of absorbs the alchemical and Paracelsian influences, and Theosophy and Rosicrucianism was born from this synthesis. So if we want to find evidence of this pre-existing mysticism, we can go to the Confessio, where the writers of the manifestos clearly state their positions. The first quote here emphasizes that the order is a Christian order, first and foremost. But I'd like to draw everyone's attention to that they state that Christianity is only most purely professed in Germany. And this is an example of a sort of a German chauvinism, which occurs again and again in the communications we have from Andrea and his circle. They sincerely believed that Germany was a spiritually chosen nation. And so we have to understand this in the context of the Lutheran Reformation. And my interpretation of this is that Lutheran Orthodoxy is the exoteric and even esoteric Christian theology and mysticism of the sect. I'm sure many other people would agree. But we see this echoed in the second quote on this slide, where they make it clear that anyone who is accusing them of heterodoxy, that they condemn the East and Muhammad. They're not Catholics, nor are they Muslims, because the Fama is a bit ambiguous on this fact. So they're very clearly trying to state that they're Christian mystics in the Lutheran tradition and that Germany is a special nation. And I'm going to come back to this later, this chauvinism that the writers of the manifestos have, because later we can see that it even manifests against members of other Protestant sects. So this is just a profoundly Germanic theological bias that the circle of peoples who wrote the manifestos have. But I think that even Luther himself was drawing on this mystical tradition that existed in Germany from before the Reformation, and the seeds of Reformation were actually laid at that time. And one of the mystics that Luther was drawing on was Johannes Tauler. So Johannes Tauler was a disciple of Meister Eckhart, and he wrote a book of highly influential sermons. And the connection between Tauler and Rosicrucianism is mentioned by a few people. I found it mentioned in several sources, but it's usually mentioned sort of in passing. Someone will bring it up in a work of literature and then discard it. I did just discover a paper 2 days ago which writes about the subject, but I haven't had a chance to read it. But so that was a surprise. But most of what I've found, people will mention it, and they'll mention the Friends of God, and then they just sort of let it go. So Waite talks about this in Real History of the Rosicrucians, that he's very disappointed to discover that rather than being ascended masters on the Tibetan plateau, the original Rosicrucians, he calls them Lutheran heretics of a very mundane variety, which I think is, it's rather, he was born Catholic, he was raised Catholic, so I think that's why he finds it disappointing to discover that they're Lutherans. And he mentions Tauler, and then he keeps on going in his history. And I also found a reference to this in the first ever issue of Quattro Coronati from 1896, where they mentioned that Rosicrucianism emerged from the circle of Tauler originally, and that more research should be done on the topic. But I'm not aware of any other research that's been done since, and perhaps there are books that people have published that I haven't heard of. I don't know. But in general, the connection is mentioned that Tauler is what influenced Bohm and the Rosicrucians, and then it's sort of people tend not to go into it. But I think that's a shame, because Johannes Tauler has a deep mystical message to tell us. He was the chief disciple of Meister Eckhart. He's notable for taking Eckhart's work, which is a highly mystical, heretical, and earth-shattering message, and turning it into a practice or a tradition which people of a less mystical inclination could participate in, although there were still some mystical elements. He's sort of like the loyal disciple who takes the master's message and translates it into something they can understand. And the book of his that survived was called The Sermons, and I think this book had an influence on Jakob Böhme. And he was part of this group called the Friends of God, which is a mysterious spiritual group connected with the heresy of the free spirit, which met outside the bonds of the church. And in this group, we can see the beginnings of radical. These are seekers who follow the inner light, looking for God beyond the realm of orthodoxy in an inner mystic Christianity, forming communities of seekers outside of the church. So Tauler's Friends of God is sort of the beginning, or more accurately, sort of a reinvention even, because this tradition does go back before him. So as I mentioned, Tauler was a disciple of Meister Eckhart. And in addition to him, Henry Suso was also a very notable disciple, and they influenced de Rosicrucianism, which I will go into in a moment. And this context for seeking God outside of the church that was characteristic of the Friends of God and the Brethren of the Free Spirit, it was driven by a time in which the Great Schism was occurring and the anti-pope was in Avignon. And this caused an immense rupture in Christendom, as both popes attempted to discredit the other, and they published propaganda about corruption in the rival churches. These sorts of polemics would be reused in the Reformation. So in a sense, the schism of the church made the public aware of the corruption in the body of the church, because the church was attacking itself. And so it's rather interesting that in sort of an exoteric political sense, as well as in the esoteric Christian mystic sense, the seeds of the Reformation were laid in this time. And I have here on this slide the Theologia Germanica, which I also have a copy of it here, which people who are interested can look through it here at the Atlantis. You can also find it online in the public domain. This book was written anonymously by a member of the Teutonic Knights. It's a book of devotional mysticism. It was also connected to the Friends of God and Eckhart, and it had a direct influence on Luther. And the reason why I think this is important is that radical pietism is a child of this era. And many of these people who were responding to the fact that the church was fragmented started to found sort of lay religious orders outside of the church. And these are groups that I think we who are Rosicrucians should be most interested in, because, you know, the Rosicrucian ultimately is, in a sense, a holy order outside the boundaries of the church. And these pietist orders may actually be part of what the writers of the manifestos are alluding to, or at least, even if they're unconscious of it, they were also in this tradition. And so the most influential and important of these orders were the Beguines and the Beguards. And when we talk about these groups, really we're talking about the Beguines. The Beguines were an order of women, and there were also the Beguards, who were male Beguines, but it's the women who had the most influence here, and they initiated the movement. The Beguines were women who organized themselves into autonomous, spiritual, intentional communities. Today, we would call them communes. They formed nunneries outside the bounds of the church, and the church was incredibly worried about them. They were worried that these very spiritually active women would go astray and fall into heresy. So they sent a trained theologian, Meister Eckhart, to monitor them and make sure they didn't say or do anything heretical. So they wanted a man to go and like run these orders of women. But unfortunately for the church, things didn't go according to plan. Instead of monitoring them, Eckhart went native, and he was influenced by the writings of these women, and he himself began professing heretical views, and then he was tried for heresy. And I heard recently that he's the only trained theologian in the medieval era to be tried for heresy. I don't know whether that's true, but this is something I heard. And one of the things which makes Eckhart's mysticism so unique is that he had a theological education. So he'd read mystics like Dionysius the Areopagite, and he'd been influenced through him by the philosophy of Neoplatonism. So when he did take this path, he was influenced by the practices of the Beguines. What emerged was very powerful and dangerous. He was practicing women's spirituality within a masculine sphere and in a masculine way. And so this was incredibly threatening to the church, to have someone like this. And before his verdict was received, I think we don't actually really know what happened to Eckhart. He may have died. He just vanishes from history. But there is a papal bull that's put out that condemns him. So we don't really know what happens if he was burned at the stake or not. But we do know that many other members of the Friends of God, which were sort of the society which came up after him, they were burned at the stake and they were heavily persecuted. But we also don't know if the Friends of God had been founded at the time of his death. Like I said, there's actually very little that we know historically, but you can read the writings of these mystics and be informed by them. And speaking of that, this story is actually really about the Beguines, the women who influenced Eckhart, especially because this part of the story was only recovered in the 20th. It's only very recently that we've, especially, you know, Eckhart's story was only recovered in the 19th century, and the story of the women was only recovered in the 20th century. So it's only very recently that we've been retelling this in our society. And Mechtild of Magdeburg writes an incredibly beautiful book called The Flowing Light of the Godhead, which I highly recommend. I've read this book, and at the beginning, Mechtild says you have to read it 9 times in order to truly take in its message, and I've only read it once. So I cannot say that I understand it according to Mechtild, but I can say it's a book of visions, and it's very beautiful, and they're very transformative visions. And at one point, she mentions a new holy order, which will emerge at the end times. And this group will travel through all nations and be highly persecuted and heal the sick gratis. And I could not help but be reminded of the Rosicrucian order when I read this. And if anyone is interested, there's a great translation of her book that was published recently in English, which I have there on the slide. And then the other 2 famous Beguines were Heidewich of Brabant and Marguerite Porret. And I'll talk more about Marguerite Porret later, because she had a direct influence on Eckhart. And this slide sort of summarizes many of the things I've been saying, that they organized themselves into the Friends of God. This was the beginning of radical pietism. And there's a book there called God Within, which tells this whole story and gives a great summary of what all of these mystics taught and what they experienced. or you can just read the direct writings. The influence of this tradition was conveyed beyond Germany, and it reached England via the Netherlands. And there are many English mystics mentioned in God Within. My favorite is Julian of Norwich, who in some of her writings, she imagines Jesus Christ as though he were her mother, which I find incredibly touching and kind of profound. And indeed, much of the mystical visions of people like Porret and Eckhart really go beyond gendered conceptions of God. Although bridegroom mysticism, there's often a metaphor for the soul as being essentially feminine before God. There are also, the women in particular offer different images of what the soul is and how you can, how the ravishment of God is supposed to occur. But I also want to draw everyone's attention to Rosicrucianism, a very important mystic from the Netherlands. And he attempted to harmonize the heresy of the free spirit with the orthodoxy of the church. And he did this by creating a mysticism which follows the via positiva. The via negativa is the way of unsaying to reach God traditionally in the church, which is where you put forward a statement about God and then you take it back. And the via positiva is where you try to assert as much as possible about God is all good, God is all wise, God is all knowing. Whereas the via negativa is God is not, this, God is not, God has no space, God has no form, God has no shape. So he tried to create a path that would express what was essentially a via negativa practice in a positive way. And he identified the Trinity with the Godhead. And Evelyn Underhill viewed Rosicrucianism as one of the greatest mystics who ever lived. And you can read her book about this, which I have there on the slide. And this is an incredibly subtle form of mysticism. And while it does get very sophisticated, it remains identifiable as being within the tradition which began with the Beguines. And so now I want to talk about this sort of spiritual conversation which exists between Germany, the Netherlands, and England, with sort of lines of mutual influence. It goes in both directions. It goes in the 17th century, and it resurfaces in many ways. It's evident when the Familia Caritatis, the secret society from the Netherlands, transmit their teachings to the court of Elizabeth I, and when John Dee travels to the continent and transmits his message to Rudolf II, influencing the formation of Rosicrucianism. They're kind of mirroring this conversation that occurred in the 14th century. This is purely my own ahistorical. This is just my speculations about the whole thing, but you can see similar patterns mystically in the people who speak in the 14th century and who speak in the 17th century in a movement from east to west and west to east. And so it's almost as if there's sort of a historical reprise where Jakob Böhme's mysticism is quite similar to Eckhart's in some ways. And Spinoza, like de Rosicrucianism, kind of takes mysticism and tries to put it in a form that you can understand. And it doesn't always work, of course, you can't. And Francis Bacon replies to William of Ockham in the sense that they're both sort of empiricists, but there is also a kind of a mystical dimension to empiricism as well. So there's sort of a theme that's returning to the symphony that begins in the 14th century, and then it returns again in the 17th century for sort of a last hurrah before it bows out. And now, returning to the 14th century, I want to mention one of the most important parts of our story, which is actually the Knights Templar, which you probably, you were not expecting them to show up in this story. I was not expecting them to show up in this story, but they are connected to the Beguines in an indirect way. And what happened was when King Philip needed to find a way to burn the Templars, he set his inquisitor William to find some way to burn them. And William said, well, let's try them for heresy. But there wasn't any legal means to do so yet. There was really just no legal case for persecuting the Templars, who were members of an order. It was sort of absurd. But William was aware of Marguerite Porret, who was a Beguine, who'd written this book called The Mirror of Simple Souls, which this book was lost to history until 1934. It's only just returned to our consciousness. And he suggested trying her for heresy because the book was clearly heretical and she wasn't recanting it. So what they did was they burned her book and they burned her right afterward, well, a few years afterwards. And then they burned the Templars about a year after that. So the whole thing was sort of set up as a way for them to seize the Templars' assets. So there's a whole, there's a common cause between the Beguines and the Templars, which also was lost to history until I really think within the last generation. So I'm just going to read this one quote by Michael Sells, which I think kind of conveys the impact that Porret's death had on this whole story. So within a few years, Porret's name was being associated with what was called the heresy of the free spirit. A series of propositions were condemned in 1312 by Clement V in a papal bull, and in another papal bull, restrictions were imposed upon the Beguines and the Beguards, their houses, and their habits. In 1317, Clement's successor promulgated the bulls, and a major inquisition was begun in Strasbourg by Bishop John of Durkheim. In 1327, the friar, theologian, administrator, and preacher Meister Eckhart, who had preached in Strasbourg and whose ideas show strong Beguine influence, was also condemned in a papal bull. And for the next several decades, inquisitions were carried out throughout Central Europe against alleged followers of the free spirit heresy. So what happened was the burning of the Templars and the searching for it really created a persecution of all of these people who were all connected as being part of Europe's spiritual underground. It led to the persecution of Meister Eckhart, and perhaps that led to the creation of the Friends of God. I mean, no one knows. The Friends of God are incredibly mysterious, and I think you really have to read German, which, like I said, I don't, to really understand what they're about. So we're nearing the end now. My talk is rather short, but I'm just going to pivot, sort of speculating about some of the bigger picture meanings of this tradition. And the first question I want to ask is, was the 14th century Hermetic? And there's really always been, since the beginning of Rosicrucianism, a need for Protestant Germans to justify having received Hermeticism from Italian Catholics. And this continues to this day, but there is some evidence that there was some Hermetic teachings in the German-speaking world in alchemy, but not very many. Meister Eckhart was a Neoplatonist, which is connected to Hermeticism. And there was also the Book of the 24 Philosophers, which contains 24 aphorisms, and it comes from Sufi literature. And the first two aphorisms in this book are Hermetic. But there's also Manichaeism. There was an immense influence of Islam upon these groups from way too many different directions for anyone to even be able to understand or summarize that. But I want to talk about Manichaeism, a Persian religion in the Zoroastrian tradition that was founded by the prophet Mani in the 3rd century, and it was influenced by the teachings of Christianity. And I'm bringing this up because in the history of the Rosicrucians, calls the Rosicrucians Manichaean Buddhists, which I think is a very strange statement to make. He talks about how they've moved to India, and this may have something to do with the Theosophical Society and their fascination and appropriation of Indian religious practices, which they put into the Western spiritual tradition. But Manichaean Buddhists are associated with the city of Merv in modern-day Turkmenistan. It used to be called Bactria. And they were also associated with the persecution of Buddhists in Tang Dynasty China, where even though Buddhists were the ones being persecuted, Manichaeans were even more persecuted. And I have on this slide, if you see the picture, that's the only Manichaean temple that survived in this world today. It survived by pretending to be a Buddhist one in China. So they were highly, highly persecuted. And they were persecuted not just in China, but also in Europe. There's the famous heresy of the Cathars, which were persecuted in the Albigensian heresy. And they are said to have practiced a Manichaean tradition they received from the Bogomils. And this was happening really about 100 years before the era we've been talking about. And also, as is well known, I mean, I'm sure many of us have heard this before, the Templars were inspired by the Ismaili Shi order known as the Assassins. But what is less spoken about is that Ismaili Shi Sufi orders often transmit Manichaean esoteric teachings. I'm sure I don't have very much direct experience with Sufis. I think I know actual Sufis, if there are any here, might want to correct me on that, and I would appreciate any correction. But there's a Zoroastrian matrix which really seems to exist, and Zoroastrianism is the Persian tradition that Manichaeism sort of grew out of. Especially in Iranian Sufism, and anyone interested in this subject and what is interested for Rosicrucianism, there's the work of Henry Corbin. That's where I sort of heard about this. But Manichaeism is connected to the history I've been talking about here because it's also a part of Europe's sort of free spirit underground of heretics and the persecuted, whether Templars or the Beguines or Cathars. And finally, on this slide, I mentioned the infamous Jesuit Abbé Barruel, whose conspiracy theories after the French Revolution hinged on Freemasonry being identical with the teachings of the Templars who practiced Manichaeism, which is total nonsense. And this conspiracy theory has done a lot of damage over the years. Well, but on the other hand, there is a kind of, it's rather eerie, there's a sort of a grain of truth to it, is that Manichaeism is often transmitted through Sufi orders. And what these early Christian mystics of the 14th century was often something, the Majorcan mystic Raymond Lull talked about a Christian Sufism in his novel Blaquerna, and he certainly had contact with the Sufis. So on the other hand, they were seeking to create something similar to this. So you know, I don't know, it's all purely speculation, but whether there was some kind of Manichaean transmission or teachings that were running through this underground. I know that many there are a few orders that I've heard of that believe that this is the truth. I don't really know myself. I have absolutely no idea. But I think it's interesting to bring this up because this is when people talk about this this history, that Manichaeism is part of the story in a strange way. So returning now to the Rosicrucian order of the 17th century. I want to conclude by just making the statement that, you know, we tend to focus on the Hermetic and the alchemical aspects of Rosicrucianism, but the Hermetic element is like a plant that's rooted in a soil, and the soil is Christian mysticism, possibly influenced by Sufi Manichaeism that goes back before Lutheranism. And too often we overlook that radical pietism did not begin with Jakob Boehme, that it extended back to the Beguines and perhaps even before to people like Hildegard von Bingen. And the manifestos are to some extent aware of this tradition, and the figure of Christian Rosenkreuz is a metaphor for exactly what Antoine Favre says Theosophy and Rosicrucianism was. Christian mystics who discovered Paracelsian alchemy and the Hermetic wisdom of the East. So in order to understand Rosicrucianism, I would say that it's important to understand this tradition of German mysticism from which it sprang, or at the very least, these mystics have something to offer us. If we go to the visions and the visionary works that they offer us, there are discoveries that might be there if we're called to go there. And then it's also important to talk about the Christian mysticism that was the motivations of the people who wrote the manifestos. And the most famous of them were Johann Valentin Andreae, Tobias Hess, his teacher, and Christoph Bessold, who turned on them and joined the Jesuits. And one of the interpretations of why there was silentium post clamores was because the people who wrote the manifestos were persecuted by those who were orthodox enough, but they also didn't like puffers and enthusiasts who were interested in magical power or making gold rather than in Christian mysticism and building utopias. And I do want to focus on Andreae here for a bit, because there's something about this German chauvinism that I mentioned at the beginning that I think is worth bringing up. And lots of people talk about how in his 20s, Andreae is experimenting with these radical Hermetic ideas and you know, magic and alchemy. But in his 30s and 40s, you find him, he's very conservative and he's only talking about really orthodox Lutheranism. But if you look closely at even his youthful writings, you find that really many of his basic views remain unchanged. But they just sort of changed the way they were conveying them to the world. The circles who wrote the manifestos, later on, they try to distance themselves from Rosicrucianism, but they still keep trying to build an Antilia, a Christian utopia. They keep trying to actually construct an ideal society. They just stopped calling it Rosicrucian for all of these many reasons, that the church would try to persecute them in the 30 Years' War, and also even some of the people who were interested in Rosicrucianism were just interested in wealth or power, and that wasn't what they wanted. But in a letter to Comenius, who really is sort of in a way the successor of Andreae in the next generation, Andreae very enigmatically describes Rosicrucianism as a ludibrium, or a joke, and he also condemns Comenius for being a member of the Czech Bohemian Brethren rather than a German Lutheran. And Comenius responds in a letter that Andreae is being really rather bigoted. The Brethren rebelled against the church with Jan Hus well before Luther ever did. So he's saying, why would you claim, like, we should be Protestant brothers here? Why would you claim that Lutheranism is more true Protestantism, or that I'm Catholic? So he's saying, you know, this is odd, and he has a real point. But I think this is really part of this Germanic chauvinism that is another undercurrent in all this, and this also does resurface at some times in movements relating to Rosicrucianism and German culture. And unfortunately, most recently in the early 20th century, it resurfaced in the form of the totalitarianism we know as Nazism. So this Germanic chauvinism is also present. I mean, it's present in Lutheranism, and it was present in Rosicrucianism. And I think it's also something that we do need to acknowledge. And even with other Protestants, Andrei was sometimes, quite bigoted towards them. But that Comenius did go on to write Via Lucas and became the Comenian Fama, and in many ways he took on Andrea's mantle. It's just it's just an interesting little tiff between people in sects. And so on this point, there are two books which deal with this material that I'm just going to talk about here. The one on the right is, really, it's a great book of history. It's a book for practitioners. It's talks about the Lutheran history of Rosicrucianism and the circle of people surrounding Andrea. It also talks about the whole Hermetic tradition. Actually, many of you on the call will know more about this book than I do, by Tobias Churton. And the one on the left, on the other hand, is quite scholarly. It's very obscure, but I wanted to bring it up because it contains material that's just never been published anywhere else in the world, including like actual bylaws of the Unio Christiana that Andrea and his circle were trying to found. And the title of the book, A Tessera of Antilia, refers to the password given by those to prove they were members of these underground societies who sought to build an Antilia, which is a utopia similar to the one described in Andrei's novel, Christianopolis. And there also, mentioned in this book are two other utopian novels that Andrei wrote in later life, which I really think these novels have never been published. They're just in the Bodleian in Oxford, and no one's ever dug them up. And I haven't really looked very deeply into this. I don't really know much about it, but there are a lot of unpublished Rosicrucian papers in the Hartley papers at Oxford that this guy, Donald Dixon, wrote about, but no one's really gone and brought them out to the public. So there might be something out there. And I think that this book is an incredibly unique resource that really sort of cements this idea that radical pietism is the final mode in which, the way in which at least the people who wrote the manifestos originally understood what they were doing, even though there was definitely this esoteric hermetic element to it as well. And with that, this is my last slide. And I want to thank you all again for your time and for listening. And thank you very much for this opportunity. Thank you.
Jack, could I ask you, please, how would you define the characteristics of what you refer to as radical pietism?
Well, I think that especially in the 17th century, there were people who were engaged in Christian mystical practice that did not involve regularly attending church. And the mystic practice involves a relationship really with the inner light. You find similarities even with sects like the Quakers and the Puritans. But what defined pietism in the most distinctive way were the writings of Jakob Boehme. It was also in many ways a progressive movement. And I think it was socially progressive in that these people were really questioning institutional authority and were looking at different ways of understanding, or really saying that, God is present in the world. You can find God everywhere. God is present in your heart. And so God isn't necessarily in the Orthodox book. It isn't necessarily in the church. And this was quite dangerous to say these things. So some people were quietists, who were people who believed something like this, but didn't say it out loud. And other people did say it out loud and were quite persecuted. And it also, I think, had an influence on the formation of science because, this is the Rosicrucian element, is that if you're a pietist and you believe God is everywhere, also understanding nature can help you to understand God. And I think that's sort of one of the ways in which science itself was kind of born.
Thank you very much, Jack. I wholeheartedly agree with your last statement in particular about nature. So I'd like to open this up now to everybody present. Please feel free to ask questions of Jack or offer your thoughts and ideas relative to the topic. Thank you.
So, yeah.
I mean, I think the three things that just came across very strongly to me in the paper was place and communication, that we think of the past as people living isolated lives in particular locations. But here we have ideas crossing both in terms of texts, but also as people. But when I originally come from Norwich, and one of the things you can still see in Norwich is the beguinage that was there in one of the prime locations where a community of Beguines existed really up until the Reformation, and were there at the same time that Julian of Norwich was writing. She chose, I mean, Julian of Norwich's book is the oldest extant book written by a woman in the English language, and she was an anchorite and didn't move. Her ideas did. Her contemporary, Marjorie Kemp, who sought spiritual counsel from Julian of Norwich, wrote the first travel book written by a woman in English, and was an astonishing woman who made pilgrimages to Jerusalem, brought ideas back. And so suddenly we can see the past as a very dynamic place. And interestingly, Arthur Dee, the son of John Dee, who inherited his father's books, chose Norwich to come back to at the end of his life, and in a sense completing this circle that Jack sort of points out. Alas, when he died and left the Dee library to another great figure, or last great figure probably in Norwich spirituality, Sir Thomas Browne, the collection of Browne's books that were due to go to the Royal College of Physicians were then lost. But I think there's almost this sense that Jack brought out of ideas and movements. These were ideas moving, people, and people coming together and talking, often under the most difficult circumstances. The only final thing I would just say is this sort of sense that Andre says that the Rosicrucianism and the chemical wedding was a ludibrium, a joke. Sort of, we can see that now as something that was trivial, but jokes and humor, as we were talking earlier, is like fakes and forgery. A joke can be used to change consciousness, just as a creation, a literary fable or a literary work can. And in a sense, it may, I mean, this idea that to be real doesn't, to be true doesn't, that reality and truth, that it's true whilst not necessarily being historically accurate. So, I mean, I think for me, this talk has brought out a huge number of interesting points that flow from this argument of seeing a trend of thought and theology and of civilization and esotericism that flows through, rather than a specific sort of event in the past, the writing of a book.
Seekers, they looked for an alternative path, but to what? Because traditional path always leads to God, as everyone is told. So why look for an alternative path?
I think that's a really, really good point, Hasu, and thank you. I think that one of the things you have to keep in mind with what happened with the Rhineland mystics and what happened with Europe in the 14th century more generally is that, you know, the church was really a Roman institution. And yet many of these people, I mean, especially Germany has a very important role to play in this story. Germany was never really conquered or colonized by Rome. On the contrary, Germany conquered Rome. And so when you say that, but then they sort of absorbed Rome's culture. So to them, it's that when you see, especially in the Reformation, when people rebel against the Christian church, there's this element of them saying, well, that actually isn't our traditions. And what were our traditions? Because they had different traditions beforehand, before they were Christianized. So I think one of the central conflicts, you know, spiritually in this, and it's still, you see it today, I mean, it remains in Europe today, is this, it really goes back to this question of the empire and the church as an institution. And what people who were looking for that alternative were basically saying was they were saying the church has strayed from traditional religion. We need to go and find traditional religion again. And the reason why the church was said to stray from traditional religion is because it had become materialistic, because it had become a tool for the empire, and especially people who came from regions like the Rhineland, like these German mystics, who historically had never been controlled by the empire, but now they were subject to Rome. They were saying, wait a minute, why should we follow this dogma when it doesn't even follow a real rightly guided spiritual motivation? So in a sense, I would almost look at it as like from their perspective, and obviously Catholics would disagree with this, right? But from their perspective, they would be saying that no, actually, the church has fallen from what's traditional religion. We're going to the alternative to try to find traditional religion again.
So would you say that traditional religion in the 14th, 15th, 16th century, as we progress, allowed certain amount of dissent, but within the bounds that they would accept or agree to? And if you went beyond that boundary, then you were classified as a heretic or a non-believer. It was a way of the church saying, okay, now this way we can identify those who are sort of not following the rules, but let's give them enough rope and hopefully they'll hang themselves.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely true. And I think that in both the Christian and the Muslim world, there was a fear of allowing people to view God as being present in the world, as not being a transcendent principle that the priests had access to, because that would lead they were afraid of something like polytheism reemerging. And so I think that's another element to it, is that yes, there was this kind of control, but especially that control was based around who has access to God. Because in the old world, you could go and pray at any brook or any tree, but in the world of the monotheists, the regimented institution is supposed to control. And there might be some leeway. Some saints might be brought in. Okay, maybe they have slightly heretical views. Oh, we'll Christianize them. Okay, so yeah, that kind of thing does happen. Yeah.
I think there is a very interesting point you raised in your presentation, which is the connection between Manichaeism and Rosicrucianism. You say that Arthur Edward Waite was under the influence of a sort of Eastern fascination of his time, saying that there was this connection. I'd like to know if you have some traces or proofs from an historical point of view of such an influence on Rosicrucianism by the Manichaeism. Thank you.
I have absolutely no proof at all. No proof. And I don't think anyone does. I know that, if you go to the Embassy of the Free Mind, they mention the Persian tradition a lot, and they mention the cup of Yamshid being identical with the Holy Grail. Certainly there's a theme, but there's always been a theme throughout the Western philosophy of Persia being imagined as this mystic place of the East, the cult of Mithras, and Plato talks about the Magi. So, and the three wise men in the Bible. So it's all throughout our culture anyways, is this idea of Persia as this place of esoteric magic and mystery. So I don't have absolutely no proof at all, historical proof about this whatsoever. And also about Waite being influenced by the Theosophical Society. I mean, that was just a speculation on my part as well. I just thought that it was probably part of the Zeitgeist at the time, because I thought it was a very curiously specific thing that he said. But I have absolutely no historical proof of it. But that the idea in the imaginal sense, in the esoteric sense, that the connection between Manichaeism and the Invisible College has been very fruitful for many mystics, I think, even though there's no historical connection whatsoever, except with the Cathars.
I would like to put a question, please, to Jack. You mentioned Meister Eckhart, and that there was a strong influence from Meister Eckhart toward the early Rosicrucian way of thinking and practicing. But you said that Meister Eckhart had been influenced by 3 female mystics.
Yeah.
This I find very interesting, that it was through the female mystical experience that influence then had the effect that it did on Meister Eckhart, and therefore forward from there. Do you know anything else regarding those three female mystics, please?
Well, again, I keep making discoveries all the time. There's a second Heidewitch that I just discovered a few minutes before this talk, and there's also a Beatrice. But you can read. I think the best way to get to know them is to read the primary sources, which I mentioned in the talk, and also I can send a bibliography, which I can put in the chat for anyone who's interested. Mechtild's book is called The Flowing Light of the Godhead. And we don't know much about Mechtild, but they were, but she was like Julian of Norwich. She was the first woman to write in the vernacular in German. And Heidewitch of Brabant, I actually can't remember what the name of her text is off the top of my head, but reading Marguerite Porret's The Mirror of Simple Souls is also a way that you can hear what they're saying. And particularly Marguerite Porret had a great influence on Eckhart. And I was just reading about this now, that Eckhart actually stayed in the same Dominican house as William of Paris, who had just persecuted Porret right after that trial, and he could have maybe even gained access to these writings from him. So that might have been the way that he was influenced. The Beguines were, really the people who started this movement. It was started by the women, and if you read their writings, the power of the divine feminine is in them. I was just reading something about the ways in which gender is the distinctions between gender are abolished in a reading of Porret and Eckhart next to each other, because they use very similar imagery, and there's a way in which both of them are transcending the clothes of gender to stand their souls naked before God. And I think that it's incredibly powerful what happened, and what he did when he sort of joined the Beguines rather than being someone who would persecute them. So yes, I think that the best way, if you want to learn more, is I will post this. I have this link here that I will put in the chat. And you can go and look at the bibliography. There's a book, this is one of the books I haven't read, called The Beguine, the Angel and the Inquisitor, which is about how Porret's trial got tied up with the Templars. But you can read The Mirror of Simple Souls, and you can read The Flowing Light of the Godhead to gain a sense of these women. And I think there's a lot more that we know about the Beguines now than we used to. I hope that answers your question.
So that's a wonderful, really helpful response. Thank you very much, Jack, and thank you for sharing the information in the chat. I think that the title of that book, The Flowing Light of God, is wonderful as well. Very, very evocative title.
Once again, just an amazing way of looking at particularly earlier history than we normally do, in a way that I think is rarely kind of put together in the way that you have. And we've kind of discussed some of this before, but what I found interesting as well is there's this long utopian literary trend that Rosicrucianism is both kind of birthed from and then helps create a lot of momentum with. And the fact that you were talking about the Beguines as being a kind of a communal, intentional community, utopian kind of movement of mystics, small though it may have been, kind of seems to fit into that narrative quite a lot. So I'd be interested to hear more what you think about that. We've got Andres Christianopoulos, we've got Francis Bacon's New Atlantis, you mentioned Comenius, Labyrinth in the Paradise. We've got, that then leads into, and I know, Jack, this is kind of an area of the states that you have knowledge about, the Ephrata community and other pietist communities that colonize Pennsylvania. And so this utopian side of Rosicrucianism, I think, is something that's quite fascinating and needs to be put into more of a formal timeline. Whether it's all connected or not is another matter. But and I say that also because I think it's something that speaks very, very strongly to what Rosicrucianism can contribute today, because utopianism always has to speak into the context of the day that it is. And I think today we both have many clear kind of issues that need to be commented on, but also quite unique ones, technologically speaking, in particular, but also scientifically, medically, that weren't part of the utopian literature of the past. So more of a comment, but springboarding that, Jack, because I know it's something that you know quite a lot about. And you mentioned that book. I'm definitely going to get to, was it Donald Dixon or someone, about that utopian thread in Andre and others. So thank you very much. Amazing talk. I expected no less, of course.
Well, thank you, Rob. That's very kind of you to say. I think that definitely go look at the Donald Dixon book, because there are things in there that you in particular will really get a lot out of. And I recall reading in there that there were 2 utopian novels, but I did not follow up on that at all. It's just, oh, that's interesting. I wrote 2 more utopian novels after Christianopolis. But to the best of my knowledge, those are in the Hartley papers. And the book also tells the story sort of how Samuel Hartley and Comenius got involved in this quest. And I think that the idea of building an Antilia, I think I'm really grateful you brought up Ephrata, because the idea of building an Antilia, they were really looking where can we actually found the Antilia it comes from the name of the Antilles, and it was their idea of the utopia they were going to build. And at first they were looking, can we found it in the Baltic? And then they were saying, can we found it in America? And they never got the funding together to do it. They were never able to do it. And that's sort of the story of the book, is that they couldn't get it together. But Ephrata represents the closest any sort of Rosicrucian affiliated group got to actually building that Antilia. Ephrata is sort of the realization of their goals, although I think it was a generation or so later that they actually achieved that. So I don't think it wasn't the same people. But if you read in that book, and there's a lot in there, there's way too much than I could ever remember of all these people who are involved in there. I'm sure you will discover some things. The only thing is that it is very academic, so it's one of those books that they want you to pay a great deal for, but I got it through interlibrary loan, so I got it at my local public library. So that was how I was able to read it. So yeah, thank you for your comment. It was really quite beautiful.
I'm very interested in the trends of Rosicrucianism that carry on from the 14th century through the succeeding centuries and groups to pass on. We've mentioned a few of them today. One of them was utopianism, as we just said. Another one was the valuation of nature and a derivation of mystical insights from the study of nature. That seemed to carry forward. And also the pietistic focus on the inner light. That seemed to be something that was there from Johannes Tauler and the Friends of God, going forward to, as Ian Gladwin talked to us about, the Golden Rosenkreuzer. They had a similar pietistic theurgy that was integrated into their system. And then going forward into the 19th century, there's a fantastic book that Sam Robinson recently published called Alois Mailander, A Rosicrucian Remembered. I don't know if anyone has read this book. It's highly, highly recommended. And what he explores is Mailander's teachings in the 19th to 20th century about looking at the inner word and the inner light. Again, that's this continuity through time of this teaching that we find in Tauler and the Friends of God and through Andrea and so on. So I'm just wondering if there are any other kind of Rosicrucian universals that have passed down through all of these succeeding periods and groups that you've kind of identified, Jack, in your studies.
Wow, that's a great question. Thank you so much. I think most of what I identified, I put in the talk. The big question really for me is about Manichaeism and Hermeticism, and I'm still really sort of investigating what's the proper relationship Rosicrucianism had to the Hermetic tradition, because obviously it's a Christian Hermeticism. And what you find that's really new in the 17th century is Paracelsus and these Hermetic ideas that are coming from the Italian Renaissance. So even though I mentioned in the talk that in the 14th century, they had books like the Book of the 24 Philosophers, and they had some alchemical practices in the German-speaking world, there really was a huge infusion of the spirituality and knowledge that came after Ficino and Lazzarelli translated the Hermetic texts. And so I think that's the one sort of ingredient that sort of created Rosicrucianism, and that makes it, it's both similar, it's recognizable as descending directly from this lineage I just traced. But so the new event that happens in the 17th century is suddenly this Hermetic tradition almost sort of collides with a pre-existing tradition of German mysticism that existed in Germany and the Netherlands and in England. And in all cases, sort of like new and wild mutations occurred. And I think Rosicrucianism is one of that. And then one of the things we got out of that was modern science. So I think that that sort of, that's the one big question I still have, and that I think is really, it's one of these big questions that's too big to answer. You just sort of wonder about it, and you keep on going. Is really Manichaeism. What is the relationship between Manichaeism and the Brethren of the Free Spirit, and even, I mean, the Templars certainly were influenced by Gnostic ideas, but at the end of the day, it's I tend to actually take them seriously when they stand up there and say we didn't commit heresy. I mean, certainly there were esoteric truths they transmitted, but but was there Manichaeism there? We don't know. We'll never really know if there was a kind of Manichaean Gnosticism that was transmitted through the Cathars and all of this. And these are things that I think people have been talking about this kind of stuff for hundreds of years. I don't think it's the question's ever really going to go away.
In relation to the times we're living in now, obviously, the study of the history of these orders outside of the organized church is very fascinating, and it's wonderful to look back and see what was happening in those times and the influence of certain teachings and practices. What I'd like to ask you is, what do you feel may be a parallel in contemporary society now in relation to many of the things you were speaking about earlier? Really, the word radical pietism implies something which shakes things up. The whole of the teachings in the manifestos as well were very radical in their day. And what do you see of practical relevance as maybe mirroring itself in relation to the times we're living in now societally?
Wow, what a great question. Thank you so much. So one of the things that I think about is if you recently, the Royal Society published a statement about New Zealand. And what happened was the Maori have become more and more involved in wanting to govern New Zealand. And culturally, I mean, they have had more involvement politically, but also culturally and spiritually as well. And there's been a movement to teach Maori science in schools to children. And the Royal Society published a statement saying, that it's with a bunch of prominent scientists signing on saying this is anti-science, this is horrible, we cannot teach Maori science in school. And I think that this is really a shame. And the reason why they're doing this is obviously that the Maori, they have taxonomies about traditional plants and animals, but that they're in a mythic traditional way where they talk about gods and heroes. And modern science can't accept this in its natural form and becomes a very almost vituperative, like violent towards it, saying this is not science, when it is science. And they also believe in a spirit world, and it should be fine for them to believe in a spirit world. There shouldn't be any problem, even if science is supposed to be holy material, which I don't think necessarily it should be. But even if it is, this shouldn't be a problem, because then it's holy material, and they also have spiritual beliefs, and you don't touch it. So we have an issue in our society where, even though we say that we are very free and we say we're very radical and we're very open, that things that the Brethren of the Free Spirit were talking about are still unsayable in certain circles, especially in academic circles, where you go into these spaces and you want to say that God informs the universe. Well, we have secularism and we have tolerance now, but at the expense of making it actually impossible to conceive of God as being present in the world. So that still is true today. It still is true today, even though the institutional power of the church is less in the West. We've achieved this at the expense of creating a scientific system that's opposed to indigenous knowledge. So I think where we come in, And where we can make that offering is we are a spiritual tradition which stands at the origin of science. And we can stand there and mediate between both worlds and remind the West that, look, the scientific practices are grounded in a spirituality. And we can be the group that mediates between the indigenous people who their time is coming now and they deserve to, you know, have their culture be celebrated on the world stage and not be punished for it. And people who have been historically oppressed in Europe, mystics as part of the spiritual underground have a natural common cause with these people. So we should ally ourselves with them and work from the inside to try to create a new kind of science that can be more accepting. That's what I think the relevance is. This tradition, but I think one of the ways, at least the way I understand like the difference between Boma and Rosicrucianism is like Rosicrucianism is what happens when you apply like the inner light to the idea like let's reform science. Like the moment you're looking at like there's also kind of a scientific element to it. Like if you read in Christianopolis, he has like all the 7 liberal arts and then some, and there's sort of a goal to like have the following in the footsteps of nature is like you're knowing God not just through meditation but also through like investigating nature and understanding things and like being a little bit of an alchemist in different sorts of ways. At least that's my interpretation of the link between them. Yeah, I don't know if that, yeah.
Very good answer then.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I just want to share this with you. We're talking about nature and perceiving lessons from our interactions with nature. This is a subject is very dear to my heart. And earlier, I've got quite dirty fingers, as you can see here, because they're covered in soil. I've been out in a garden here and doing some clearing away of old debris, old spent flowers and plants and branches, cutting them back and just leaving the bits that are wanting to reach up toward the light. But there were some things there that were covering just old dead leaves getting in the way. And as I cleared them out, I could see there were lots of new things just trying to get up and, to be able to receive more light. And I think it's true of all of society currently. That it's in need of a good pruning, and that we need to remove the spent, the dead, the outmoded frameworks and institutions and the clutter, to provide an opportunity for those who are coming through to receive more light. I wonder if you'd like to comment on this. Any thoughts, please, Jack, on this?
I think it's a very beautiful emblem that you've just painted for us through your own experience, and that's in a way very Rosicrucian, you know, that you're taking this experience and you're turning it into an emblem. And I think that, yes, I mean, the new creation always needs to be recreated and made new, and that means that the old has to be discarded. And I think every generation rises in a new environment, even though it's also there are also things that are eternal. I think it's a very, very beautiful metaphor that you just presented to us, and thank you.
Thank you very much.